Chapter 15, Article 27, and Mr. Whitehouse. You going to give a presentation first, and then Mr. Robertson?
That's correct. Mr. President, if I could just provide an overview of the documents submitted into the record. This is an ordinance to delete Chapter 115, Article 17, the Vacation, Retirement, Residential Park District sections of the Code, which is sections 115 through 132 through 115, 140 in their entirety, and to replace that entire section with Article 17, Master Plan Zone, sections 115, 132 through 115, 140 in the place of those current provisions. I'm going to yield to Mr. Robertson in just a moment to present, but to provide an overview. This is submitted into the record for this ordinance. We have a copy of the ordinance as it was introduced to County Council at its meeting of February 7th of this year. We also have a copy of the Plus response dated March 22nd of this year from the Plus meeting that was held in February. And then we also have 4 written comments that have been received, and we also have the County Council staff memo to County Council that have been received, and they are included in your paperless packet. This ordinance was subject to a public hearing before the Planning and Zoning Commission and its meeting of September 14th of this year, and at the meeting of October 12th of this year, the Commission recommended adoption of the ordinance for the reasons as outlined within the motion, and subject to a series of recommended revisions that Mr. Robertson is going to go through with you. And a copy of that motion, along with the draft minutes of both of those meetings, is included in your paperless packet. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I believe you had a statement.
Yeah, for this ordinance number 23-05, I noticed some concern. Some people thought they didn't have enough time, I guess, to read through P&Z's recommendations and that kind of stuff to us. So I will tell you, when this is all done, when the hearing's over with for this, we will close the public hearing. We will defer and leave the public comment open for 10 business days so the public can make comment on this thing up until the close of business on October 31st at 4:30.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Robertson.
Thank you. This is one of the last steps, hopefully, in what's been a long process. Mr. Whitehouse went through the procedural history of it. I know we have some young ladies and gentlemen here from the local high schools and the Optimist Club who are following the government process. I know you know the process, but just a quick overview. We drafted the ordinance after having some discussions with council. That ordinance actually is 17 pages long because we have to show the language that we're deleting as well as the language that we're adding. In this case, just for your benefit, we deleted the Vacation, Retirement, Residential Park District in Article 27 because that's never been utilized in Sussex County. It doesn't exist anywhere. So it was a section of our code or an article of our code that was dormant. And so rather than create some new section, we deleted that and plugged this in. Once the ordinance was drafted, it was introduced, as the screen says, on February 27th. Then one of the things that Mr. Whitehouse I don't think touched upon that's important, we did take this ordinance through Plus. We had a meeting, Mr. Whitehouse and I did up in Dover with Office of State Planning Coordination, and we got input from all of the state agencies on this initiative, and I would characterize those, Mr. Whitehouse, as positive. There were some constructive comments, not many constructive comments, but overall a positive response, I think, to what we were looking to do. And that's due in large part because it comes from our comprehensive plan and their involvement in all the work that we did to get into that comprehensive plan. We had the planning and zoning hearing. As Mr. Whitehouse stated, the record was left open. We did receive written comments, and the commission then on October 12th made a recommendation for approval with some suggestions and recommendations. Because County Council has seen this multiple times already, and I think you all are fairly familiar with it. I'm not going to dig super far down into it. I am going to go through, because I have to make a record, and explain it, and I will admit it's probably a presentation that looks somewhat familiar to each of you. But that being said, I would like to make that presentation again or today. Again, the master plan, or MPZ district, is directed fairly extensively by our comprehensive plan and all the work that went into that. We do have a residential plan community within our code, or RPC. This is on a much larger scale and allows much greater design flexibility and development types. The RPC, if you think of it this way, those generally still have to conform to our zoning code. So if you do an MR RPC, generally you still have to comply with the MR rules. With an MPZ, basically through the hearing process, you're almost creating the set of rules or an ordinance essentially for that MPZ that governs that development. So it's much more flexible than what we can do with an RPZ. Again, it's intended to promote unified, integrated, large-scale developments of 200 acres or more, where appropriate. Instead of, if you have, say, 600 acres, that's a large piece of property, but this would be a better design tool to have one unified master plan development over that 600 acres instead of 6 100-acre unrelated subdivisions and maybe some commercial that don't interconnect with each other, don't have any design continuity between them. This way you have one project that does one large tract of land with the roadways all interrelated, the utilities, the design, everything. And so hopefully it's a better product as a result. It does have essentially 4 parts to it. Primarily it's residential, and that includes single-family and multifamily units, both home ownership and rental, presumably, neighborhood commercial, professional, medical, and financial office areas, and civic areas. One of the things that is in the MPZ is that you can't do all of one of those things. In other words, you can't use this to make just a high-density residential development, just like you couldn't use this tool to also make, a great big shopping mall without any residential. You have to integrate parts of each of those. It is a 4-step process, and I'm going to go through each of the 4 steps, and each one relies on the step or steps prior to it. So by the time that you get to site plan review by staff, that's going to be based upon the administrative review of the plans by P&Z, the public hearing before P&Z and County Council, and the very first step in all this, which is the meeting with Mr. Whitehouse and his staff. So with that, there we go. The first step is a pre-application meeting. That's not a lot different than what happens now because, there are pre-application meetings with Mr. Whitehouse and his staff that occur currently. But there will be a discussion of the overall design, the floor space, and the dwellings created. DELDOT discussions just to see what needs to be done with DELDOT in terms of the traffic reviews and roadway improvements and whether a TIS is required. They will look at such things. It talks about resource buffers here, but there's going to be open space resource buffer, the overall design of the project. One of the things that I'll get to in a moment because there was a recommendation on this, but participation in the Sussex County Rental Unit Program was discussed, and also the PLUS review. So that's sort of step 1 of this process. Step 2 is the more, important one. This is a collaborative step. This is where there are public hearings before Planning and Zoning and County Council. At this stage, the general overall master plan of the MPZ is reviewed. There's a spatial distribution plan that's reviewed, which I will show an example of that in a moment. There's a master manual that's submitted, that's the design guidelines, and those, again, prevail over Chapter 115 and Chapter 99. So those design guidelines are going to prevail over our zoning code and our subdivision code. I'm not going to list those, I think it's 15 or 16 items, but those are the specifics that go into that master manual and what need to be provided and discussed. And again, this master manual essentially becomes the ordinance or code governing the MPZ. So, again, if you're doing an MRRPC, you'd be governed primarily by the MR zoning code and what's required by the MR zoning code. Here, your development is going to be governed by that master manual, the spatial distribution plan, and the general overall master plan. That's why it's collaborative. There has to be engagement between the public, the developer, planning and zoning staff, and county council, because as a result of that collaboration, everybody needs to come up with a master manual in particular that will be the tool that governs this project going forward. Obviously you can approve it and deny it, but at the same time, you have to essentially create this master manual that everybody's going to live by. The benefit of that is that if at some point there is a change down the line, it's a change to the ordinance affecting, or the master manual affecting that project, versus if it's an MRRPC and they want to change the code, they have to change the whole MR zoning code that affects all of Sussex County. So it's a really useful tool. It requires a lot of, as I said, collaboration, but when it's done, I think it should govern the project and result in a good project. So the next step, after we go through those hearings at County Council and Planning and Zoning and get those items approved, if they're approved, is to go to Planning and Zoning. This is essentially the parallel with what we do now, the site plan review stage at Planning and Zoning. There's also at this level an implementation plan which is essentially like the site plans and an implementation manual. And this is more specific detail, again, that has to be consistent with the master manual and the general overall master plan. This is where you kind of dig down into the nitty-gritty of the overall, each individual section or site plan within the MPZ. Again, staff's going to have reviewed that, and it's going to come to the Planning and Zoning Commission for approval. And then, after that is approved, it's on an administrative level, and this is site plan review by staff, which also parallels what we do currently. I know, as Mr. Hudson might remember, on planning and zoning, frequently we see now where there's a preliminary site plan approval, and the motion is to approve the preliminary site plan approval with final approval by staff upon receipt of agency approvals. That's kind of what we're talking about here. You're getting the site plan review and approval at that administrative review of plan stage, and then it comes back just through staff once all the agency approvals are done. And Mr. Whitehouse, as I'm going through this, if there's anything that you need to chime in with, please feel free, because you're going to be sort of where the rubber meets the road on this as we go through the process. So this is an example.
Wait a minute. We have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Before we move on,
Mr. Riley.
can you give an example of, go back to the previous slide, only minor clarifying amendments may be entertained at this stage. Give an example of a minor amendment.
So we actually have that in the code, and it's towards the end on the last page. There's examples. Minor amendments may include but are not limited to the addition of material for landscaping adjustments to specific street or alley placement of not less than 50 feet, or a change in location of structures in an active recreation space, and those are just examples. It says any major amendments as determined by the director will be required to be approved by the Planning and Zoning Commission, provided, however, that amendments that are inconsistent with the approved MPZ, General Overall Master Plan, and Master Manual shall require an amendment to both following a public hearing before the Planning and Zoning Commission and County Council. So it's sort of minor things would just be done by staff or maybe go back to P&Z. And you know, there's not a one-size-fits-all criteria for that. Kind of like what we have now with conditional uses.
Right. But there is a level that would trigger potential public hearing.
Yes, yeah. But again, you know, if you keep in mind that the goal of this is almost to establish an ordinance for this project, I think it's easier to tweak that ordinance for this project if necessary than somebody come in and say, the MR zoning district doesn't work for me, we need to change the setbacks or whatever in the MR zoning district.
Right.
But the idea, you know, I will say, though, that the goal is not to keep coming back to planning and zoning and county council.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah. So this is an example of one that Mr. Whitehouse's team prepared. It's a sketch of the spatial distribution plan. It does outline the different densities, and I'll sort of zoom in on those in a moment. Again, shows the overall circulation and transportation system, shows the area locations, again, the civic area, the neighborhood commercial area, the professional office and medical and financial area, shows the open space, shows how they're dispersed throughout the MPZ. And also one of the things is, Mr. Whitehouse and planners, you know, the goal is for this to be sort of somewhat self-contained, not that other people from around the county wouldn't be able to use it, because we want it to have some vitality and viability, but also that if you live there, you can potentially work there and also shop there. So there's a walkability element that we want to see in these plans too, and that's referenced in the ordinance as well. So this, again, just sort of zooms in on that spatial distribution plan, and you can see how the residential and the types of residential are broken down in that, as well as the commercial type uses. And that just shows that mixed use is encouraged throughout the MPZ. You know, and what we mean by mixed use is, for example, where you'd have residential over retail, that sort of thing. This just shows those commercial areas, again, with open space out front. And the same thing, complete streets, you know, so that there's streets that flow through the entire projects with walkability, so that hopefully once you park, you might not need to get in your car to go to the grocery store or the commercial area or the restaurant or the civic area or your office, along with active frontages. So that is an overview of the ordinance. What I'd like to do is just go through, as I want to get these on the record, the recommendations that came out of planning and zoning. These recommendations came from staff, Mr. Whitehouse and myself. We also had meetings with some folks who would actually be implementing this early on, prior to the introduction and actually after the introduction. We got some good feedback on that. We also got some good feedback during the Planning and Zoning Commission's hearing. And I'm going to try to summarize these. Hopefully it won't take too long to do so. But so the first one is, and this is a significant one, when it was originally introduced and based on our comprehensive plan, it was limited to the growth areas, the coastal area, the developing area, the town center area, and I'm trying to remember the developing area. Yeah, I was drawing a blank there. There was comment at Planning and Zoning, and the Commission also thought favorably upon this, that these are of large enough scale that we shouldn't just limit them to the growth areas in Sussex County. If it's big enough to essentially support itself with enough different type of housing, diverse housing types, and commercial and office and civic uses, then it shouldn't necessarily be limited to just those growth areas. However, the Commission also in its motion made it clear that if it is an area outside of growth area, there has to be an assurance that it will be served by adequate on or off-site utilities, and that it's scaled to accommodate and pay for any infrastructure services or improvements required by either the state or the county. In other words, I realize that there's going to be questions about this, particularly we hear about level 4 areas, for example. We didn't want to, the Commission didn't want to shut the door. Jamie, I think you hit the button. The Commission didn't want to shut the door on these being in level 4 areas. It may not appropriate for them to be there, for every one of them to be there, but we ought to at least have the possibility for those to go there if it makes sense. So that's something that the Commission put upon County Council to consider and decide. So it's on your table now. But that was something I'm kidding about that a little bit, but that was an important consideration. If these are large scale enough, they should be able to at least be considered anywhere throughout the county. Another one that came up was the ordinance as introduced had a provision in there that at least 20% of all multifamily dwellings shall be set aside as SCRP units governed by Chapter 72. A little bit of background on that. That was added because we are giving flexibility. It was sort of like we should get something in return in the form of affordable housing. That's one point. The second point was it was 20% of multifamily dwellings. We thought about how best to word that. I know there's a question, I think, from one of the letters that we received. Why just multifamily dwellings? The reason being is that our SCRP program really is governed towards multifamily dwellings. It's not, the rental program doesn't work as well with single-family homes. The home ownership program might, but we haven't had anybody use our MPHU program. So that's why it was 20% of multifamily dwellings set aside. But we heard at the hearing that this could be a potential blockage to somebody utilizing the MPZ. The reason being, not that it would be, but kind of we don't know yet. We only have one SCRP project that's been built thus far in Sussex County, although it was expanded since its first approval. I think there's another one, Mr. Whitehouse, that's got preliminary site plan approval, but it's not built. And we only just amended our SCRP program within the year or so. And so the comment was, until we know that that is a viable program, not to make this a potential hindrance to somebody using the MPZ. In other words, we've got all these great possibilities with the MPZ. This one thing could cause somebody to say, well, I can't do it. And so what the Commission recommended was that it should continue to have an affordable housing component, but it should not specifically be tied to the county's SCRP program established by Chapter 72 of our code. Again, the rationale being what I just described. So the suggestion was that that line be modified to state, there shall be a substantial affordable housing component of the MPZ that shall be described in detail in the master manual. The goal of this affordable housing component shall be to serve the intent of the Sussex County MPHU and SCRP programs as set forth in sections 72-2 and 72-16 of Chapter 72 of the Sussex County Code. So the goal being, you don't have to use the SCRP. Come to us with something that's similar to the SCRP or MPHU programs that satisfies the intent of our code as set forth in our code, so that it gives some flexibility. Again, that would be baked into the public hearings and that master manual that County Council and P&Z would see. Oops, Jim, you jumped ahead on me, I think. Yeah, there we go. So alternatively, this was another recommendation. If the MPZ is not expanded beyond the growth areas, then add reference. There was reference to the coastal area, developing area, town center, and commercial areas in the whereas clauses. Just make it clear, since those don't carry through codification. The whereas clauses kind of drop off once it goes in our code. This just wanted those added in to the code so they would appear in the code. Another one was clarify that in addition to higher densities, the commercial areas or more intensive uses should be centrally located on or along main roadways consistent with higher density residential uses. The way it's said now is that those more intensive uses should be only in the middle of the MPZ. This way, if you have a border that's on a more significant roadway, you could also have those commercial or office or more intensive uses along that roadway, not necessarily just in the center, which wouldn't necessarily make sense. So this gives a little more flexibility.
You could have a substantial roadway in the center of the community, couldn't you?
Yes, and that's sort of the goal, and kind of the thought being that, if you had an existing substantial roadway, that a new substantial roadway teed off of, you could have it both places, not just centralized, but that's correct. The next one's just sort of wordsmithing. It's changing a reference to existing planned arterial or collector road. Those aren't clearly defined in the zoning code. These should be changed to major arterial roadways or collector streets, which are defined terms. The next one is just confirming that all collector or primary roads within the MPZ must be constructed to DelDOT standards and state maintained, and that all of the roads should be or shall be dedicated to public use and remain open. This kind of goes in line a little bit what we've talked about here lately with interconnectivity. That if you're going to have a major road like Mr. Schaefer was just talking about, that should be a DelDOT road, and then the roads that lead off of that would be private but open to public use and dedicated to public use.
And the only approval you need from DelDOT to turn that road over is to build it to their specifications, and then they would in fact be almost required to take
Right.
ownership.
Well, yes, and because that's going to be front-loaded in the conversations with DelDOT early on, with the TIS and everything else. So yeah, they're going to tell you how to build it, you'll build it, and then they'll take it over. So, yeah. And there is a recommendation that I'll get to in the end that deals with that too, Mr. Schaefer, or a comment that was not a specific recommendation, but something the commission wanted council to consider. As drafted, the ordinance referred to service alleys, and there was sort of a mandatory requirement that there be service alleys. And talking with designers, we came to the conclusion that the requirement of service alleys is too much of a hindrance. They may not always work given an overall design. And that was one of those things that, we weren't going to draw a line in the sand on either in drafting this. Just that service alleys, I think Mr. Whitehouse and I talked about, that wasn't significant enough of an issue that we were going to maintain it in this whole thing. Again, kind of like we were talking about with those commercial areas, allow the neighborhood commercial areas, professional office and financial areas and civic areas to have frontage on existing DelDOT rights-of-way and not just an internal main street. Again, that's just a design issue. There was a requirement about parking so that it was sort of basically as invisible as possible. That was a requirement. This gives it a little more flexibility so that it's designed so that off-street parking is screened from rights-of-way and non-commercial uses so that the buildings and landscaped areas are more visible than large off-street parking lots. As originally drafted, the lots would be behind the commercial areas, and in talking with folks, we realized that didn't necessarily work. Just because you can't always have parking behind because of ADA compliance requirements and other things, that it makes sense to be able to have it in front as long as it's screened. This one also had to do with the service alleys. This is just revised the lines that are referenced so that service drives shall be designed and utilized for loading and trash collection. In other words, to get those off the main roads as much as possible and sort of behind the scenes a little bit more. There was, in the neighborhood commercial area, a prohibition against drive-throughs, restaurants. I think banks were allowed in retail places. But in hearing from folks on this, that was kind of a showstopper because, for example, we all know pharmacies nowadays have drive-throughs, and that's an integral part of their operation. So we recognize that that prohibition probably didn't work, and it was another thing that it wasn't worth drawing a line in the sand on, frankly. That was such a minor issue. The next one's technical. Master Transportation Plan approved by DelDOT. We just learned that that's better worded in coordination with DelDOT to say traffic impact study for the MPZ approved by DelDOT. The next one is, this one, the ordinances introduced had somewhat specific requirements for architectural details. This goes to Mr. Riley's comment about changes. One of the things we realized that this is going to have a lifespan because it's a large project over quite some time, that we didn't want to get too much into architectural details because, you know, styles change. And so you didn't want to have to come in and keep changing that sort of thing. The other thing is, historically, Sussex County does not get into architectural details, and so that was one we wanted to pull out. Same thing with the next one, which was lighting design, and we deleted some specifics on that. I will say, I didn't mention this at the beginning, these two in particular came from how we drafted this ordinance. And for the benefit of the folks here who probably heard me say this before, as a reminder to you all, how we came up with this, we didn't draft it from scratch. Frankly, that would have been impossible, I think. I don't know where we would have started. So we looked around at one that has been in place and utilized, and Dover happens to have one. The Eden Hill development in Dover actually has used it. And by all accounts that we've known of, and Mr. Whitehouse has, I think, been somewhat involved in that, either directly or indirectly, it's been a successful one. So we took Dover's code provisions for an MPZ. I think they call it traditional neighborhood design or something like that. But we sort of deconstructed that and then reconstructed it within how Sussex County operates, or tried to as best we could. There was certainly, because it's a municipality, and for example, Dover owns the streets, you know, so that doesn't work for Sussex County. Because it's a town, they, I hope this doesn't sound like a criticism, but they have the ability to micromanage things more on a town level, like streetlights, than we do in Sussex County. So those are the kinds of things, and others that we took out. And also, of course, the process, we made it fit more closely to how Sussex County goes through a zoning process.
So I'm sitting here thinking to myself, if one of these projects was large enough, how are they going to be governed? Are they going to simply have a, an owners group that governs it, or, homeowners association, or, are they going to be large enough so that they would look at potentially having a charter and becoming incorporated, or?
I suppose if it was 150 years ago, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
Because that's how towns started. Now, the way I would envision this, and we do have this example in Sussex County. We see it in, I think the Villages at 5 Points is one. I think it's in Bayside. There's some others that I think the Peninsula is the same way. Other larger communities where there's one overall governing organization with its sort of master governing documents, and that, like take the Village at 5 Points, that's built out. So that governs, generally the commercial, the neighborhood central district where the restaurants are, as well as I think out front maybe part of it where there's the food line, and then all the different types of residential. But then within the residential, there are sub-associations. And I'm not saying this is exact, but like, for example, the single families would have their own sub-association. And if you think of Village at 5 Points, there's condos and townhouses, for example, and I don't know if this is exactly the case there, but they would have their own sub-association, and then the commercial would as well. So, and it's sort of a hierarchy.
So would there be a method that's prescribed to help to foster that organization structure, or is that something that each developer would create on their own?
So they would create that on their own because that's all governed by Iowa. I mean, so that's all already established by state statute. So
yeah, I mean, I just can see, somebody's got to make sure the trash is getting picked up and the streets are clean and
right.
there's not too much crime and stuff like that. I mean,
yeah.
There's a municipal aspect to these.
No, it's true. But we've also seen that work, I think, successfully in these larger developments. Where
I have a number of subdivisions in my district, Spring Lake.
Sure.
Village of 5 Points, Coastal Club, a couple others that I can't think of at the moment. They have an umbrella organization, and then.
Well, and also the fact of the matter is that those organizations are dealing with governance, but what they do, and all the ones that Mr. Schaefer talked about, and all the ones I can think of, they hire a management company that runs all that stuff to make sure that the streets are clean and the trash is picked up and all that sort of thing happens too. I would imagine, frankly, on this one, it would be large enough that if you had a management company, they would probably have an off-site office here to run that development, which may be what the Peninsula and Bayside do. I'm not exactly sure. But,
Sure.
But, I mean, it's not that there's a vacuum for that because all of that is governed by and pretty heavily structured by Iowa.
I happen to know that down at Bayside, there's issues between the residents and the ownership and the HOA. It's just the handoff has not been real smooth, apparently. And I'm wondering, like that large development that's outside Sterling, it's over in Sterling, Virginia. Outside D.C., can't think of the name of the community right now. It's massive. I wonder how a place like that is structured.
Yeah, and I know what you're talking about, but I don't know the name of it. Yeah, I
Columbia,
think of
Maryland.
Columbia, Maryland's one that comes to mind.
Yeah,
as being along those lines. So
yeah, I mean,
they are
huge.
Virginia.
I mean, they're as big as a town.
Yeah,
and I could potentially see. Well, we've had talk about some potential applications that sound like they could fall into that sort of category. And I'm just wondering how if this adequately addresses those issues, or if it needs to, even.
Well, I mean, I guess that would be a question for you all. The thought I will tell you going into it is that it doesn't need to because Iowa does. We would either be potentially duplicating what state law says or potentially inconsistent with what state law says, and that would really bind everybody up if it did something that was different or created two pathways for how you had to govern a development like this. I would agree with you if, as I said, frankly, even before Iowa, because the state code, it was fairly general and vague on governance. Iowa is not. I know Mr. Morgan probably attested that. It's very specific on how you have to set these things up and the governance of them and the reserve studies and everything else. So, again, I'm not particularly concerned about that because I know that there's that process, and there's also with the state ombudsman, there's relief available through that state code as well. So.
And we do, if I may, we have a process at the moment, as we have with subdivisions. We do check restrictive covenants and homeowners association documents, not line by line necessarily for all of these issues, but we make sure that there is provision in there that there is an entity to be created to take care of the common elements, like open space. So we do check to make sure that's in there, but we don't police that per se. So.
And those are recorded.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Bear with me 1 second. I'm going to check something. This is what I wanted to double check. In the master manual, too, it's item 15 of what needs to go in that. So there's the application and administration, and it talks about, in that master manual, in addition to Iowa, you have to set out the roles and responsibility of the developer, the builders, and the homeowners, and or the homeowners association, and the overall administration of the manual's requirements. So that would be up front in that master manual. And candidly, I hadn't really thought about this before. That's probably somewhat of an improvement over what we do now, because this way, that is set out up front in this manual that everybody knows how that transition is going to go, or should know, or at least on constructive knowledge of it. It's right now set out in Iowa. We say in planning and zoning approvals that there has to be a homeowners association or condo association set up to maintain all this stuff, open space and roads. But we don't really say that you have to tell us how that's going to happen. I mean, we review the covenants to make sure it's in there, but this actually says you got to tell us how you're going to do it and when you're going to do it. So I think I hadn't really thought about it in that context, but that's better than some of the situations we're actually dealing with now a little bit. So, yeah. One other thing that's not on here, two other things. One of the recommendations or suggestions by planning and zoning, and this is one that we've been talking about on the staff level. It's not really part of the ordinance. It's more coordination with DelDOT. As Mr. Schaefer and I were talking about, making those main roads and how that's turned over to DelDOT. One of the things we want to make sure we have a comfort level with DelDOT on is that once that road is turned over to DelDOT, DelDOT's not going to come back and make an applicant or developer want to do individual entrance approvals off this new road that didn't exist before the development was approved, kind of death by a thousand cuts, so to speak, on entrance approvals. What we want to make sure that we have an understanding with DelDOT is that they approve the road network. So that would be not only the main DelDOT roads, but also the roads off of that. So it's sort of one-stop shopping. And the same thing with bonding, that at least there's the opportunity to bond it once through DelDOT instead of having multiple bonds that are triggered by all these different entrance approval processes that go through DelDOT. So that's not a change to the ordinance. That was a recommendation, frankly, from staff that made its way into that P&Z motion. The other thing that wasn't in here in the P&Z motion, and I'm not sure why, and I'm going to just put that out for consideration. Somewhere along the line, somebody mentioned that the civic area, there's currently a cap that it shouldn't be or can't be more than 10% of the overall area of the MPZ. Again, originally that was put in there just so that there was a number so that, somebody doesn't use this to create a giant concert venue with no residential and anything else. At the same time, the comment was that 10% may not be enough. If you look at Columbia, like with Merriweather Post Pavilion, if you're ever familiar with that, that's a fairly large venue that's an amenity to that area. We have Bayside, and I know there's issues with that, but, that's a performing arts stage that, may or may not be, I don't have any idea, but may or may not be more than 10% of the area of that development. The thought being, and I'm putting this out here for consideration, to either increase or do away with that cap so that you're not limited on civic areas. Civic areas include government buildings and other things, but they also include recreational areas or performing arts centers as well.
So potentially do away with it altogether?
No, do away with the cap, not do away with the civic area.
With the cap?
Yeah.
Do away with the cap?
Yeah.
So they could be 50% or 80%.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
maybe do away is too strong, but come up with a number that isn't so limiting as 10%.
Would that be an example of a major change that would trigger a hearing?
I think on that it would, yeah. If you came in and said, all right, we're at 10 or we're at 9%, we want to go to 17%, that would send us back through, with the whole.
Should there be specificity and detail as far as what thresholds have, when they're met, require public input?
Again, we talked about that, and that's one of those things that is just difficult to quantify, because you just never know.
Can't anticipate every
and if you don't anticipate it, then you're almost saying, well, I'm not in this list, therefore I don't need a public hearing, or that would be the argument that's made.
Right.
This way it gives a little bit more discretion. And, just like we do now, there's always that backstop where, like we said, it sort of goes one way towards the final approval. It goes the opposite way if there's a change. If staff's not sure that this isn't a minor change, they could send it to P&Z, and P&Z could say, okay, it's minor, or we're going to send it back through, the public hearing process. So, again, the goal being that we don't keep doing that. We really don't want to have to.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would add, too, is that, to use that example, if that's a public hearing, it's not a public hearing on the whole entire MPZ all over again. It's a public hearing on, we were at 8% for our civic area. We want to go to
just the change.
Just that one change, and whatever the impacts of that might be. That's really the end of my presentation. We had on, you've seen this before, this is, and I'm not going to go through this, but this is just Eden Hill, the one that was built. This is a large, sort of medical, professional, financial office building that's there. This is an example of their master manual. you can sort of see some overhead shots, and this, I think, is dated at this point. There's been more development out there, but this shows multifamily. It shows offices. It shows those medical buildings. It also shows it's on a fairly wide scale, when you look at it with the rest of Dover surrounding it. So, anyhow, that is my presentation for this afternoon. I know we've been in front of you, it feels like lots of times on this. I'm happy that we've got to the finish line. It was interesting. We got one letter of opposition that says, this is just a bad thing. We shouldn't do it. Why are we doing the MPZ? And I know Mr. Hutt's here, and I tend to agree with him. This is not for everybody. It clearly is not. However, it's a useful tool, I think. I think for the county, for developers, but the county in particular, everybody's kind of slotted into one particular type of development, whether it's a subdivision or an RPC or conditional use. We get those and they all kind of look the same. This gives us an opportunity to, I think, come out with a better project for the developer, or for the county. I was going to say for DelDOT with the streets, for the public, and the developer. That gives them a little more flexibility that's not pigeonholed into one of our current zoning or subdivision types. It's got to be big enough to do it, but if it is big enough and the developer is willing to undertake, these different types of communities within this larger community, then we think it's something that will be beneficial. So.
Well, in theory, it should limit some traffic on the roads because services are available within the community, and from that aspect, it should benefit the entire community, the entire county.
That's correct. Yeah. And that's why we didn't want it, you have to have some of each of these areas. We didn't want it to just be residential, potentially, because that defeats that. You want it to be so that, again, hopefully you park your car and you can walk or bike to the grocery store. If you got to drive, you're just driving, 3 or 4 blocks to the grocery store, not get down a county road and going, all over the place to get there. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Any questions from council?
Fine job, Mr. Robertson.
Not right now, anyway.
Yeah, no, it's a heavy lift, and I appreciate that President Vincent said we'll keep the record open. I know there's people with an interest on this. We did the same thing at Planning and Zoning because this is a new initiative for the county, so, I'm interested to see what comments we receive.
What carrot are we offering, if any, to anybody that wanted to utilize this program?
So one is the flexibility, it's collaborative, but you get to come in and really design something that you couldn't design under today's code. There is higher density in it. There is the ability to do commercial. So you get that. The other thing is right now, if you wanted to do, this project, for example, go back to it. The one you can see. The next one. Yeah, good enough. If you wanted to do that one, you'd have to come in for multiple public hearings. There'd be a public hearing probably. You couldn't do an RPC because RPC limits how much and what type of commercial you can do. So that's out the door. You just can't do that for this type of project. You wouldn't be able to do that size grocery store, for example. So you'd have to do a change of zone for some type to get that commercial in there. So that would be one public hearing before Planning and Zoning and County Council. You'd have to do probably another hearing, at least one. If you're going to do a subdivision, you'd have to do a public hearing for that. If you're doing a multifamily project, that would be potentially a rezoning and a conditional use for the multifamily. Same thing for the mixed use. You could try to lump those all together, and there'd probably be, a rezoning involved in that as well, just to get the whole thing to MR or GR in the first place. So it sort of avoids all of that balkanization of your land use process and brings it under one single public hearing with one overall master plan and master design manual. So.
Is there an upper limit to how big this potential could be?
No, there's not.
It could be a Columbia, Maryland type thing.
It's got to be bigger than 200.
Bigger than 200, yeah. Because we wanted, and I will tell you, that's another sort of variable in all this. We came up with 200 because we wanted it to be large enough that it didn't replace standard subdivisions. Again, this is kind of, you got to have a unique project. We didn't want everybody to do away with subdivisions and go to this and all the flexibility on it. We wanted it to be large, and you have to be large enough to be able to sustain the commercial that goes with it. And also, but at the same time, 200 was not so large that it excluded, virtually every property in Sussex County also. To your point, I think there's probably more natural barriers on that. When you look at the parcels throughout Sussex County, obviously you got to have somebody that's willing to sell and develop. You're going to be constrained if you're next to ag preservation land or whatever else. So it's going to be, I suppose in theory you could get a Columbia, Maryland out of that, but I doubt it.
It's tough at this point, probably.
Yeah, it'd be tough.
Maybe in the western side. I don't know.
Any other questions? If not, thank you, Mr. Robertson. And